And there we go. So as people come into the room, I want to welcome you here. Of course, my name is Jay Frost, and I'm so happy to have you back here in the Philanthropy Mastermind series brought to you by DonorSearch. That's the only advertising you'll hear, because one of the great things about the company is they've just provided this unfettered platform to have conversations like the one we're going to have today. But if you want to know more about them, and I hope you'll pay them a visit, you can learn more about them at donorsearch.net. And maybe another way to think about that is if you want to know about your donors, that's a good place to turn. They can tell you quite a good bit about them, as well as what their interests are. And if you're interested in AI, that's a particular feature of the company and how it's making waves, so to speak, in terms of how we conduct our practice. There's a big ethical discussion that too, which DonorSearch is helping to lead. And I know we could talk about that with our guest today, but that's probably beyond the scope, even though he is definitely an expert on a number of subjects, including ones that directly impact the ethics of our sector, and that is Ian MacQuillin. So Ian, first of all, thank you so much for being here
Well, thank you for having me.
I know that the purpose of our talk and how we advertised it, of course, is to talk about this issue about whether or not there needs to be a fundraiser's Bill of Rights. Before I do that, I want to just provide a very brief introduction to you, if I may, and then this subject, where you work and so forth. Ian is, if you don't know already, is the founder and director of Rogare, which is a leading voice in the third sector, as well as he is, and around the world. Rogare itself is a fundraising think tank. If you're not familiar with it, I hope you will check it out today. We'll make sure to include that in the notes and put it also in the recording, which will be on YouTube, which addresses a number of issues. But basically, the way I like to think about it is taking academic theory and making sure that we understand its practice in the life and work of fundraisers. So instead of just trying to figure out what we're doing, we can actually be guided by really good, solid information. And that information is evolving thanks to Ian and his colleagues around the world. As I mentioned, he is the founder and director of Rogare, but he also, independent of that, has been a leading voice in the sector for a number of years. So if you have recognized him before, you may have seen him making the circuit all the way from, I know, Sky News and BBC and Radio 4, but also on the stages of the world, helping us to better understand how to be better at what we do. So with that, I do want to mention why we started this, and which is I reached out to you when you posted something involving, of course, a fundraiser's Bill of Rights. And this has been a discussion that's gone on in various quarters. And when we advertised it this week, AFP posted something. Mike Geiger said, we're going to have a group of people discussing this. So before we go any further, let me just ask you, how long has this particular conversation been going on?
Well, the conversation we're going to have now is almost like it's almost a bit beside the point, isn't it? It seems that we are going to have a fundraiser's Bill of Rights. I think it's been going on in a form where people have actually written and proposed such a thing, probably maybe for about 10 years. But I've been in fundraising for 20 years. I came in, as you said, I've been in various guises in the profession in one form or another. And I came into fundraising as a journalist to edit the UK's fundraising magazine. And the kind of the issues that have led to discussions about whether we need a Bill of Rights or not have been around all of that time. So irrespective of whether people have been proposing a Bill of Rights for fundraisers as the solution, I think the issues that are leading to that have been around ever since I've been in fundraising. I'm guessing they were around way before that as well.
And of course, we have other ways of discussing the work we do and providing some guidance for it. We have the Donor's Bill of Rights. If people aren't familiar with that, I would encourage them to look at that. You can find that on all the major association platforms, but especially AFP. We also have the Code of Ethical Standards over at AFP, but perhaps one of the issues is that they don't seem to address some of the challenges that fundraisers have faced historically. But maybe can you give us your view about what some of those major challenges have been and why this discussion seems so timely?
Yeah, I think if you're going to like really delve into this, do we need a fundraiser Bill of Rights? And as I said, we are going to have one. Well, you're going to have one in the USA, and then it probably will be applicable elsewhere in the world, but may or may not be universally applicable. But the question about whether we're going to have one is the Bill of Rights itself is kind of an output to the solution, is an output to the problem. It's a solution to the problem. So I think a more interesting and relevant question to have ahead of that is not, do we need one, but if we do, why do we need one? What is the problem it's trying to resolve? So bills of rights are usually designed and created to protect people from harm and protect people from being exploited by a different group. So quite often in the political sphere, the Bill of Rights is to protect citizens from the reaches of government, from government and the state reaching too far into their private lives. And you get consumer bills of rights, for example. And in that context, the Bill of Rights is designed to protect consumers from exploitation from marketers. So if we're talking about the need to have a fundraiser Bill of Rights, we're really saying that fundraisers are being caused harm or being exploited, or something is wrong in the fundraising profession. And I think most of us would agree that there are a number of things wrong within fundraising that are leading fundraisers to say we need something to protect us from that harm. And so the question is, what are those things? But also, who is causing harm to fundraisers? And whether something that's called a Bill of Rights is actually the right way, or the best way even, to solve that solution, to solve that problem. So if you think about, the first thing is that, do fundraisers actually, what rights do fundraisers have? And are those things that we say that fundraisers have, are they really rights? And then the thing we have to ask ourselves is, are those rights being violated? And are they being violated to the extent that that violation causes harm to fundraisers? And if that's the case, it may then well be worth restating what those rights are, to draw a line in the sand, to say things such as, these are the rights that we have, and the violation of these rights causes harm. And that's why we may want to explicate and set out those things in the Bill of Rights. So some of those harms, for instance, are very obviously donor dominance, and the abusive or the abuse in power relations between donors and fundraisers. So that is, and that's what the recent attempt to do that last year by Amelia Garza and Jennifer Holmes was attempting to redress. And their 5 points were very much a rebuttal or a redress of power abuses by donors. But there's also things such as the lack of a culture of philanthropy, and a lack of understanding, and a lack or denial of opportunities for professional development. So there's the joke that we tell about ourselves that fundraising is a necessary evil, and we joke about it and we laugh it off. But possibly a lot of the issues and the ills that are causing harm to fundraisers of different kinds stem from the fact that we don't have professional respect from other parts of the organization. Now, then the question is, as I said, is professional respect something we are owed as of right? And if they are, is the violation of that right causing harm? And is the Bill of Rights the best way that we can redress that? It may well be, and it probably is, but because the Bill of Rights is an output and a solution to the problem, we really have to make sure that we define what the problem is, so we know that the Bill of Rights is tailored to precisely what the problem is.
Mm-hmm. This is particularly interesting to me, because I was looking through Amelia Garza's piece, and in fact, I believe she's here with us in the room today. So yes, she is. So first of all, thank you for being here. And I'm sorry we can't see or hear you, but we definitely see your work. And so while we can't represent it in the same way that you would, I hope we'll at least honor it by bringing that into the conversation. But that issue about respect seems to undergird a lot of these conversations, whether it's the piece that she had, the piece that you've written about, where you had 3 items at the end from Third Sector, where you talked about that respect being the first of the 3. And it's implied, I think, in the other piece that you referenced in that article from Evan, is it Wildstein or Wildstein? I'm not sure which.
Wildstein, I think.
Wildstein.
I've spelled it Wildstein, but it doesn't mean I've spelled it correctly.
And we haven't met, so Evan, we're sorry if we're mispronouncing your name, but that seems implicit in there. But I've also seen this in other fields too, where this issue comes up about whether or not people are should be able to expect as a right respect for the work that they do. Is compensation sufficient? It comes up a lot with education here in the United States. I've heard that conversation very frequently in my house because my wife has been a teacher, as have several members of my family. It might seem common sense that if someone is performing any role, no matter how important we might personally feel that role to be, that they are due respect. But is that a universal feeling? I mean, should fundraisers be owed respect? Let's start right there.
Well, I think everyone's owed respect by dint of them being a human being. I mean, everyone's owed respect from that perspective. The question is respect is about professional respect for the job that you do and the knowledge that you hold in that. Right. And this raises some interesting points. So I just want to step back a little bit to talk about what the Bill of Rights might look like and the problems that it might address. So I think we also have to maybe differentiate between a Bill of Rights with a capital R and a Bill of Rights, small r, bunny ears around it like that. Because a Bill of Rights is probably going to specify the fundamental rights that fundraisers have by dint of being fundraisers. So not just the rights they are owed by being a human being, but the rights that they are owed specifically that arise out of them doing the role of fundraising, out of us doing the role of fundraising, which will encompass all the rights you owe as a person. But if all the Bill of Rights does is show you're owed to be treated well and owed respect, then whether you owe those duties to anybody anyway. So the fundamental right here would probably having to do something like with being paid fairly and appropriately and remunerated for the work that you do. And I'm a card-carrying, paid-up trade unionist member, and I would say that about anyone. But we have an extra issue with that in the third sector and the voluntary sector, in that people think that you should be doing it for less money than you're worth. Right. So in the voluntary sector, that's an important role differentiated right of fundraisers, and donor dominance, for example, would be a very fundamental right that would go in there. But on the other hand, that they are the rights capital R. On the other hand, you have the kind of aspirational rights, which maybe are more nice to have things. And they are things that it would be nice to have for the fundraising profession, but maybe aren't fundamental things. So the fundamental Bill of Rights is there to properly protect fundraisers from harm and exploitation. The more aspirational one of the nice to have might be, for example, the things it will be great for us to have, but they aren't necessarily a right to have it. So, for example, a fundamental right is probably fair and appropriate remuneration for the work that you do, but having an annual pay review might not necessarily be a right, a fundamental right. It might be a nice thing to have. Mm-hmm. And so the other thing about rights as well is, so the idea of the aspirational one is we're putting things in there because we want to raise the standards and the awareness of the fundraising profession and get better treatment than we have. But that's not necessarily the same as saying we are suffering fundamental harm and we need a Bill of Rights that draws a line in the sand, full stop, end to these fundamental harms that are being caused because our fundamental rights are being violated. And the other thing about when you start talking about rights is it's really difficult to talk about rights from talk about duties, because in many cases, duties and rights are correlative, they're correlates of each other. So if you have a right to something, it normally means that somebody else has a duty to uphold or provide or protect that right. And so, for example, because I live in a country with social welfare, I have a right to free healthcare, and other people have a duty to provide that for me. Without people having a duty to provide, when I fall over and break my leg, if I fall over and break my leg, not when I do, but if I fell over in the street, broke my leg, an ambulance will turn up, take me to hospital, I will get treated for free. Well, it's not entirely free because I pay for it through my taxes, but I wouldn't get a whopping bill from it. And they have a duty to do that because I've got a right to those things. And because I have a right to that thing, they've got a duty to do it. Without the free healthcare, me saying I have a right to medicine and to be looked after is almost meaningless without people providing that. So when we're thinking about the Bill of Rights as well, we're not just thinking about what our rights are as fundraisers, we are also thinking about what duties other people owe to us. So I think that's a really important way to be considering that when we think about what we put in there. So do people owe us a duty to fairly remunerate us for the work that we do? Yes. Do they owe us a duty to have a pay review every year? Not necessarily. They may have a duty to provide some way for us to review our remuneration package, but it may not necessarily be an annual review. So when you spoke about respects and professional respect, for example, and I was talking about the correlativity of rights and duties, why would they have a duty to respect our professional knowledge of who we are? So they have a duty to respect us as human beings, treat us kindly. But if we want them to respect our professional knowledge as a duty from them, as of right to us, then we also have a duty to make sure that we are as knowledgeable and competent as we can be as fundraisers. And I think we're drilling down into some really interesting issues here. And I come back to that necessary evil factor that I mentioned earlier. The fundraising sector is replete of anecdotes, and almost it's anecdata, because there's so many anecdotes you can start like lumping them together as qual research and lived experience, where other members of charities and senior boards disrespect, don't take seriously the professional knowledge that they hold. And it would be too glib to say they are completely wrong and they need to respect us. It's possible that in some cases that the knowledge that fundraisers hold is not necessarily always worthy of the professional respect that we say it demands, that we demand for it. So if we want, like any profession, if we demand respect for our profession and the work that we do, we've got to make sure that we're as knowledgeable and competent as possible, because it doesn't come as of right. That's the kind of respect that we need to earn.
This is also a dilemma, because it's the perception of people outside the field. We can talk about perception inside the field too, but people outside the field is influenced by their perception about the value of the work as a whole, about the third sector, the nonprofit world, as we call it here. And so one of those dynamics is people do this kind of work because it's a voluntary sector, because they're doing it because it's the right thing to do. They're doing it out of a sense of mission. They're not really doing it for wealth. And in fact, if you ask for more money, if you're a highly compensated executive, for example, at a major hospital or university, the feeling is somehow you've violated the public trust, that you shouldn't be paid in those ways because of that. So it kind of pulls away in the public discourse away from this discussion about competence. And it starts just talking about the very idea that someone working in this sector would make anything approximating what we might make if we were in the private sector. So no matter how much we demonstrate our competence or prove it through, let's say, certifications or education, how does that help as a countervailing force against public perception that people who work in the third sector should just be happy that they're working there and doing good things? It's sort of like teachers, we don't really have to pay them well because we're doing it for the kids. We have that same argument there.
Well, we've almost veered off into a whole different discussion on a whole different thing there. So you may or may not know that Rogare did some work with the AFP in Canada about developing a new narrative for Canadian fundraising there. And the hypothesis, the crux that we developed to work on that, is that these issues and perceptions that people have of the non-profit, of the charity sector, they're really ideological with a small I. So ideologies are just ways of organizing ideas, competing for public policy around that. It doesn't mean Republican versus Democrat, socialist v conservative, that kind of thing. It's just a way of organizing and presenting and understanding knowledge. So they've got an ideological view of the way charities are supposed to operate. All the things that you said, you do it out of the goodness of your heart. You've got to be small, Corinthian, amateurish, not professional, not get paid. And then the way we try to fight back and combat that is with a fact-based narrative about how we could have earned less if we were earning less than we could have done in the private sector. To which their argument will be, if we want more money, go and work in the private sector then. So we need our own counter narrative and our counter ideology for that, and which is what we did with the AFP in Canada, which talks much more about not trying to adapt ourselves to the criticism that they have and the perception they have of us, but present a confident approach to why we pay ourselves because of the change that we bring in the world, and state that with confidence, but not defend against the criticisms. Now, in terms of the approaches that you talk about in the Bill of Rights and the professional respect, I do think that that fundraising perhaps has a bit of a status issue with regard to being perceived as a profession. And that, I mean, for instance, for example, like fundraising is one of the few professions that I know that you are not actually required to learn a body of knowledge in order to practice. Almost any other profession that you could think of, or emerging profession as well that you could think of, would either have entry-level courses or courses that you do once you've got in, but after a qualifying period you have to pass them, like to be a solicitor, a lawyer, a barrister, an accountant, a surveyor, an architect. You all have to pass through a qualifying process, and at the end of that, fundraisers don't have any of that process. You must have to go through in order to be passed as competent to practice. Now, what that means in terms of professional respect is that if fundraisers don't have to show that they've acquired a body of knowledge, why should anyone take the body of knowledge they claim to know seriously? Why should you accord them that professional respect that a Bill of Rights might demand? So in order, what I'm saying is about what the bill and the quality of duties on fundraisers would say. If we are saying you need, as a matter of right and duty, to respect the professional knowledge that we say we have, perhaps just stating that we have that knowledge is not enough. Maybe there needs to be a way to show that we actually do have that, and it's worthy of the respect that we're saying we require.
Now, I know that you're obviously you've built a tremendous amount of information, study, analysis, and data within Rogare. Other organizations have attempted to provide that kind of body of knowledge as well. There does seem to be a difference between testing to demonstrate knowledge, CFRE approach, and then going to school, going to Lilly or something like that. Is that part of the difficulty? Is that the demonstration of what we know isn't clear in the mind of our intended audience, the people who we want to accord us the proper respect and fair compensation, that they don't necessarily recognize what a CFRE is, or if in fact, if we think that's sufficient, that we need to have something approximating what you would have to become, as you said, a barrister or a doctor or anything else.
I'm not saying you need to go and do a 3-year degree to become a fundraiser. It's and I think this again brings on to something else about the Bill of Rights. So if fundraisers have rights, then someone owes duties to fundraisers, but who owes that duty? Right. So is it owed by the individual charities that you work for, or are those duties owed, and are the rights against the entire fundraising profession as a profession? So what I think, if we're talking about professional knowledge, I think that if you're going to work in a profession, the profession owes you the professional development opportunities to train you appropriately in the profession that you've come into. So I think when you say, one of the things I think should be on a Bill of Rights is that fundraisers have a right to appropriate professional development and training. And I don't know who is going to have a duty to provide that, but the Bill of Rights could state this is what our right is, and leave it to work out subsequently who owes the duty to uphold that right. But I think it's really, really important, fundamentally important, that if we are going to induct people into the fundraising profession, one of the barest things that we owe new entrants to the fundraising profession is the training and the skills and the knowledge they need to be able to function. I think it's really, really unfair. I mean, we are an accidental profession. So many people fall into fundraising by accident because there is no entry path they can choose to get into. You have to rely on serendipity and luck. And that's not very equitable and egalitarian, because luck is random. And it's very hard to even out the luck. It is such a random way to get into it. And then once you're in, you're left, a lot of the time you're just left scrabbling to acquire the knowledge that you need by going to conferences. And then after, was it 2 years you've been a fundraiser, then you can do the CFRE, but it's not something you can do as an entry qualification or acquiring the job knowledge on the job. So I'm not saying you have to go to do a 3-year degree, but at the point of entry into the fundraising profession, the profession owes those new entrants some way to acquire the knowledge they should have to do the job. And that can be through apprenticeships, mentoring schemes, continual professional development, put out by the AFP or the CIOF or the FIA or something like that. But I honestly believe that that training at the moment and those opportunities are just a little bit too random and haphazard.
And now this is another risk of a rabbit hole, so I apologize in advance for that. But one of the things that Ms. Garza and others have addressed by also bringing up the discussion that's been happening in the sector most vocally in the last couple of years about donor-centered fundraising versus community-centered fundraising, and just for ease of use to use those terms, is that some people have made the case that and I'm not saying that she has, but some people have made the case that some of these things that we're discussing, especially if they involve investments, which the individuals themselves might have to make, if there's no one who has taken on the responsibility to provide us those things which we need to do our work more effectively and responsibly, that those things are barriers, especially to people coming into the sector for the first time. I've heard people make arguments that, you know, a bachelor's degree, for example, shouldn't be a necessity for someone working in fundraising. I'm not taking a position on that. I'm merely saying that that in the United States, that's a significant cost. It's sort of like your breaking a leg example. I know that the cost would probably be different if I broke my leg and if you broke yours. Where we're living, the same is true, as you know, for education. So any of these things we're talking about, I suppose if we've got nearly 1.5 million organizations that we'd recognize as 501c3s with over a $25,000 budget, that many of those organizations, probably 90%, wouldn't be able to, or would make the case that they couldn't afford to put a person through a bachelor's degree. So I guess one of the questions is, how do we make sure not only that we start providing a blueprint for what kind of education would be appropriate, so that we have the respect and the compensation that we deserve, the rights that we're accorded by virtue of having those things, but also how do we make sure that it's equitable, that people who are in no position to pay for those things themselves and trying to work for organizations that say they can't pay for those things, how do we make sure that the sector doesn't look all like me?
Well, I think the first stage in this is that it's transparent about how you get into fundraising.
Right.
If you want to get into fundraising, you go, I want to be a fundraiser. Oh, I do this, or I do that, or I do that. I've got 3 routes in. At the moment, you don't. So, you know, the way you become a fundraiser is you're walking down the road one day, you trip over, and when you've got up, you found out you're a fundraiser. Or in a very Kafkaesque way, you go to sleep one night, and then you wake up and find you've like metamorphosed into the fundraising director of a 5013C or something like that. You know, it's just this arcane way of getting into it. So right. When I talk about this, I use this like a visual metaphor or analogy. If you imagine 2 office blocks side by side, and one's labeled marketing and one's labeled fundraising. So I'm not sure how you get into marketing in the US, but let's take the British version. So two office tower blocks in London. One's labeled marketing, one's labeled fundraising. And outside at the bottom floor, there's windows all the way up. And on the bottom floor of the marketing one, there's an entry route that's labeled graduate entry, and another one is labeled apprenticeship, and another one is labeled transferable skills. And then there's a door for people who already work in marketing. And lots of people are coming in, opening the door. There's a little kiosk outside each one that says how you get funded to do this and what the costs are. And there's loads of people walking in. Next door is fundraising. And it's got windows all the way up, except none on the first floor. And there's no doors on the first floor. And there's a load of people standing outside thinking, how do I get into fundraising? And they see other people walking along, and it's almost like coming into the Ministry of Magic. They stand somewhere and suddenly they just appeared in the first floor. Then other people are walking on going, oh, fundraising, and they trip over and suddenly you see them at the first floor window. And there's a load of other people thinking, how do I get into fundraising? I have no idea how I get into it. So I think if we want to make it fair and easy and equitable to get into fundraising, we need a transparent, clear entry pathway so that we can say to everybody, at 18, when you're leaving school or whatever, if you want to become a professional fundraiser, this is how you do it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's clear routes you can do, and these are the costs associated. And once you've established that clear and transparent route, you can then start finding ways to make it easier for people from certain demographics to access that. But at the moment, there's almost nothing for them to access. And as I said, you can't really even out the luck. So in the UK, for example, one of the ways that we now have an apprenticeship route into fundraising. So there are fundraising apprenticeships in the UK. But one of the ways that people have traditionally said that you need to acquire experience to get into fundraising is to do unpaid internships, so volunteering.
Right.
Because when somebody comes for a first job, there's no way to assess what someone's skills are. You might look at their bachelor's degree, but it won't be in fundraising. It'll be in history or English or something. Or you might see they've worked in a commercial sector, but you don't know whether the skills will be transferable. There's little way for a first job to someone who's never worked in fundraising can show that they've acquired the skill that they need or have the competence they need. So to make up for that deficit, you go and acquire it by spending 6 or 7 weeks working in the summer of the charity fundraising department. Only certain people are lucky enough to be able to afford not to work for 6 or 7 weeks in the summer, in London, because that's where a lot of charities are, for no money. And that skews the number of people that we are getting in. And because you're not judging it, the entry based on competency and fairly objective standards anyway, all sorts of unconscious biases creep into the recruitment process. And so I know we've gone a little way from a Bill of Rights, but I think we can bring it back to the Bill of Rights by talking about what something around a right to transparent and equitable and fair entry opportunities into the fundraising profession. So that's not really a Bill of Rights for fundraisers, but it's a bill of a right for prospective entrance to the profession.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, to me, it sounds like it's certainly something that I'm sure the AFP would be discussing, much like the
I'm sure they're going to look at all this stuff anyway.
They're looking, I know I can't imagine what all they're looking at, but probably the more things, the better, because the issue that keeps coming to the top, which you mentioned in your article about kind of work safety, I know that's not the best way of characterizing it, but that issue, which there have been a number of people within AFP world who have talked about that, especially women who have had really unconscionable experiences within in their employment, especially with donors. Those are the stories that we hear so much about. That I know will be front and center for addressing those issues with respect to a Bill of Rights. But all these pieces do fit together, don't they? Because it's not just about whether some people have more money and some people have less. I'm talking about donors and organizations now. It's also about the relationships that we codify. I mean, what is it that that people are there to do? Are they granted the respect that they should have, not just as human beings, but performing that role for an organization which should be respected? And then ultimately, that also confers with it that they should be treated in an appropriate manner at all times, and there should be a way for them to take action if they are not. Could you talk a bit about that that work safety issue, especially from your vantage point? Because I know that some of those issues that are occurring here in North America, there have been really scary things have happened in Britain.
Oh, and in the UK. So we have a project at Rogare on donor dominance. We also have one on gender issues in fundraising, and that's being led by Heather Hill. And I'm sure you know Heather, and many of the people watching now will know Heather. Heather is Rogare's chair. And we started that project, we started in 2018, but having decided to kick it off in 2017. And that was because a fundraiser in the UK called Beth Upton wrote a blog about her experiences of being a woman in the fundraising sector. So this seemed to be an issue that we couldn't turn away from. We had to think about that and look at that. And donor dominance is an issue that Heather's really been concerned about for some time. And you may have heard the President's Club scandal.
But for those who haven't, do you mind giving?
Yeah, in 2018 there was a uh, this ball, a fundraising ball, not held by charities, held by a charity, which was more or less a drinking club for wealthy men who would have a big dinner once a year, raise lots of money. But they hired a lot of, it was infiltrated by a Financial Times journalist as to someone to come along and serve there. And they were given a brief about what type of underwear to wear. And it had to be black and sexy and skimpy and stuff like that. And so that is not a dress code that you need to give to your female staff when they're coming into a fundraising event for rich, wealthy, powerful, privileged men. And that really, we'd already started the project by then, but that helped really focus a lot of people's minds on the issue that was to hand here. But if we're talking about this in terms of rights and duties, then very simply, charities have a duty of care to look after all their staff, including their fundraisers. But there are specific duties of care they have to fundraisers, which is to protect them from these harms, from these violations of their rights. And so in terms of when we look at why there's so much turnover in the fundraising sector, a lot of time, and I've heard this, and I totally reject this because I've heard this said other times, that fundraisers should be more loyal to their causes. They should not move on to the next job just because they could get a better salary. So as we have like high turnover in the fundraising sector and people move on after a particular time, and I've heard it said before that, fundraisers aren't showing enough loyalty to the cause and the sector, and they should eschew getting a better job and stick where they are, because that causes harm for the charity. If they move on, that means that the charity has to recruit someone else. They've lost momentum. But as I said, card carrying, paid up, trade unionist, if there's high turnover in a profession or job, the first place you look is bad management. And I would venture to suggest that if a lot of fundraisers, there's high turnover in fundraising, that's because, as we've started off, something is wrong in the state of fundraising. It may be all sorts of reasons because of that. It may not just be because they feel that their fundamental rights are being violated and harm is being caused to them as a result. But I would think that that is pretty much a core part of the reason many people are moving on. But another part may be that they're in an accidental profession. So if they've accidentally got a job, it's a good chance they're in the wrong job to start with. So they move on till they find the right one. But I do think that poor management and failure of charities to exercise their duty of care to look after their fundraisers may well be a big reason for that.
We also have another dynamic, which is outside the discussion, I think, about a Bill of Rights and even accidental fundraisers, but that's people in major gift work in universities hopping from job to job, and people have different explanations for why that occurs. But certainly one aspect is if people can make more money elsewhere, they do. But that's not a situation available to many or all fundraisers. So what you're describing seems a lot more common, and there is much more discussion about that, at least that I've been hearing the last few years, than occurred before. I'm curious why you think that's so. Why we're suddenly hearing more about, I don't think I'm alone in this, hearing more vocalization about these major issues, these three, especially respect accorded to fundraisers, whether or not they're receiving fair compensation, of course, all the issues involving treatment of people, especially on the basis of ethnicity and gender. But then this big overarching piece you just mentioned, which is that there's an expectation that, they should just put up with it, no matter how they feel. Why is it that we're suddenly attuned to the fact that we've got millions of people working in this sector, a huge part of the economy, and now we're just deciding that we should care about ourselves and the people who work for us?
I think it's just that the time has come, hasn't it? We've seen a massive culture shift in the way we think about social problems and social ills. With Me Too and Black Lives Matter, it's just changed our frame of viewing these things. So I don't think the issues and the complaints about professional respect, remuneration, necessary evil like that, we're not hearing those more. But the thing we are hearing more about is the sexual abuse and harassment of fundraisers, the harms that are caused by abusive power relations and stuff like that. And I think what that has done is provided a lens that, this is a mixed metaphor, it's provided a lens that has amplified the other concerns and allowed them to be considered as of a piece, rather than just atomized fundraisers whinging about how people aren't fair to them. and for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not saying fundraisers are whinging. I was putting myself in the perspective who are saying fundraisers were whinging about these things. And I think this is now, we've just been able to see these as a whole. And I think it is a whole, because I don't think anything, you know, a fundraiser bill of rights fits into how we get into the fundraising profession. And how we are perceived, our profession is perceived as status, is going to be influenced by a bill of rights, but also influences these things. So I don't think a bill of rights is going to be a magic bullet that solves anything, or not solves it. It's not going to be a magic bullet that solves it. It will solve a lot of things, but I mean, it's not going to be the magic bullet that solves everything. But it's going to help us coalesce our thinking on things, bring things into perspective, highlight them. And I think, you know, it can only do good.
I know that you're taking a big role in this. When I say you, I'm thinking about the collective view of Rogare. And certainly we've referenced some others here that you've highlighted in your piece in Third Sector, giving them also some attention for the work that they have done. AFP is taking on this discussion in a broader way and a more public way. But ultimately, is there going to be any party or parties responsible for coming up with something that we can all hang on our wall and hold people to it? Where are we looking for that leadership?
Rogare isn't really doing any work into this thing at all. What Rogare tends to do is look at issues that are going on and then just try and, I wouldn't say we're a devil's advocate, but there's always nuance and facets and different ways to look at things.
Sure.
And we're always trying to get under the skin of an issue and look deeper in that. And it was why I said the question I thought was not, do we need a Bill of Rights? But if we do, why do we? And what is that? Because there's some fascinating questions. If you keep asking why, and why, I think there are some really fascinating questions around that. And excuse me, but the reason we started to look at that was just because one of those bills of rights did get posted, and I've seen them discussed a number of times, and I went back and looked through them, and that made me think about the things that we've been talking about. Well, not all of these are fundamental rights. If they are going to be there, whose duty is it to uphold them? And some of them, you mentioned the donor-centric idea. I mean, some of those actually aren't about fundraisers' rights and the duties owed to them. Some of the, not the actual whole list of things, but some of the entries in some of those bills of rights, they're not about the rights we have as fundraisers and the duties people owe us as fundraisers. They are still talking about our duties to other stakeholders, or to us, principally donors as well. So that way of donor-centered thinking is so infused throughout our whole professional ethos that even when sometimes we are talking about our own Bill of Rights, we can't help but talk about in a language that talks about our duties to donors as well. So our role in this wasn't necessarily, we're not trying to rival what the AFP is doing, come up with our own one. I thought it might be good to try and crowdsource some of the ideas that could go onto that. We're not trying to do something in opposition to them. We don't have a project to do this. I think what is important, though, is if whatever comes up, as I said, I think it will probably be important to choose whether you want a fundamental Bill of Rights, capitals, or a Bill of Rights nice to have. And perhaps, so is the idea that we need something to protect fundraisers from harm, or is something that we need someone to try that's aspirational, that's going to try and lift the treatment of fundraisers? And it may be a good idea to not mix the entries in the Bill of Rights between things that people actually do have a duty to uphold and things that they don't have a duty to uphold because they aren't really rights, they're just aspirational. So it may not be a good idea to mix the two together, because that just might be confusing about whether people really do have duties to uphold everything that's in there. And I really, really don't think that it should include anything about what fundraisers' duties are to other people, because we have, or you have, a donor Bill of Rights. We in the UK have the fundraising promise. We don't need something else that tells us what our duties to donors are.
Absolutely. So you talked about how you're crowdsourcing ideas. Are you able to share any of those yet, or
no, because hardly anyone replied to them. So so I didn't crowdsource any.
Oh, wow. All right. Well, obviously there's more work to be done here, because I wonder if people are, and maybe this is kind of one of the last questions, which is, if there's so much more awareness, if we're finally developing a language for talking about these things which have bothered us in one way or another. Sometimes they're annoying. Sometimes they were causing permanent harm. Why is it that we've been so quiet? And why is it that even when the discussion occurs, most people remain largely silent?
Well, I'm going to take this back into the start of the century, so not couch the answer to that in terms of the paradigm shift that we were talking about that's given us a new lens through which to view these things. So why have we been so quiet? Why have we not spoken up in support of the things that we need? And I think it's because the lack of professional status that fundraising has in the eyes of external stakeholders. And I think if people regard you as the necessary evil and they think of fundraisers as being like the people that just raise the filthy lucre, I've even heard, enough people tell me that fundraisers get the worst offices, and the comms team or the up in the nice views over the park, nice glazed windows, and the fundraiser in the basement next to the loos. And that was a story one fundraiser told me, and I'm sure there are people listening going, yeah, it's happened to me. I know that. And I think if all the time you're forcing to have to defend what you do while people disrespect you, profession, don't hold it in respect, think they know more than you, don't accept what you say as professional knowledge, I think perhaps for some fundraisers that's kind of infected the confidence that they have, and maybe they didn't feel they had the confidence to speak up about what they needed when all the time they just had to be defensive about just saying what their basic needs were in terms of the job. And so, for example, what I told you about what Beth Upton wrote about, she was expected to behave and do certain things to get male donors on board. I don't think the level of confidence and support existed in the fundraising profession at that time to enable people to speak up and talk about those things. And I think it's because there was probably a bit of lack of collective self-confidence among the fundraising profession and the individuals about what we really were and what we stood for. And this is why I think a lot of these things everything is interrelated. There's this whole causal web of things influencing other things. And so it's really impossible, I think, to take one thing out, solve it, fit it back in, and solve everything else.
Yes, it's not a Rubik's Cube.
Yeah. So I mean, that's just what I said there. That was just an idea about one of the reasons why that might be. I'm not saying it's true, but it's just some things that I've picked up over the years about the way it felt like fundraising was, some of the attitudes it had. It just felt like there was a bit of collective professional insecurity about what our role was.
Well, maybe one of the things to come out of this whole process, because I know it's being done in various places right now as we speak, is maybe people gain some of that confidence. They gain the language to talk about these things that they didn't have. They realize they're not alone, and that there's always a value in that. You talked a couple times, made references to being a trade unionist, and we don't have the equivalent in our sector either. So in addition to everything else that we'd like to have, or maybe need to have, or perhaps should have the right to have, each of those things being different, we also don't have a collective where we sit down together and say, okay, this is the hill that we stand on. But perhaps this process will give us at least one of those hills. Thank you so much for all of this, Ian. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I hope it's been insightful and helpful, and people have enjoyed it.
I'm sure it has been and will be, and I would encourage people to go ahead and not only to check out what you're doing generally at Rogare, but also to maybe be a part of this crowdsourcing conversation. So how can people do that? How can they find you and be a part of the conversation?
Well, I'm going to say, if you're going to crowdsource the ideas, crowdsource them to the AFP. That's where all the suggestions go to. This was just a throwaway thing on a blog. Give me some ideas if you want it. But we work on so many things on ethics, regulation, reconceptualizing the ethics of relationship fundraising and stuff and the practices. There's so much going on. So our website is rogare.net, and all of our publications are free to the sector thanks to the generous support of our associate members. So and we have a network of people that are engaged with us volunteering on our projects and helping us. So if you like what we do, what we say, and you want to get involved, then there's a form on the website that you can fill in, or just drop me a message on LinkedIn.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank everybody who's with us live for being here today. If you're watching this after the fact on YouTube or on the DonorSearch page at donorsearch.net, then I hope you'll share this with others who are beginning to explore this conversation and want to be a bigger part of it, as well as to benefit from the outcomes that we're sure to see in the future. If you're also interested in other sessions in this series, you'll find that we have a podcast, which will be of interest to you. And in fact, this is going to seem very different from what we just talked about. But the episode that we're releasing right now is with Lisa Greer, who's a philanthropist, talking about some of the issues that she's had as a donor with respect to fundraisers behaving badly. It might be one way of describing it. So that episode will be posted, in fact, later today. It's among all the episodes, discussions with people about their lives in philanthropy and fundraising. But you can learn about all of that and everything we have coming up over at DonorSearch.net. And while you're there, I hope you'll check out not only the schedule of upcoming programs here in the Mastermind series, but also if you're interested in knowing more about your donors, and I hope you are, you can learn a lot more about them through DonorSearch. And I'll be happy to tell you how they work and let you test out the services at your leisure. So with that, I want to thank you for being here. Thank, of course, Ian for guiding us through this subject, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Till then, take care.